Did you know that in the past year, we have added 56 new families to St. Mary's Parish? Isn't that amazing? 56 new families in the past year. Many of them have come to us from other religions, but not all of them. Some of them have come to us from other Catholic parishes. And what we'll hear sometimes when we talk with them about coming to St. Mary's is they'll say, well, you know, where we were, we kind of weren't getting fed. And you probably know what people mean when they say that. I wasn't getting fed there. And I think we can have some sympathy for that, especially if any of us have ever been in a place where we feel that way, where maybe the music just wasn't very good. Maybe it was really screechy or poorly done, or the tempos were, and so we're like, oh, it's just kind of distracting. Or maybe the homilies weren't very thought out. You just feel like he got up there and just kind of went off the cuff, or maybe it was that they were at a place that wasn't very welcoming. And all of those things matter. And I would say that here, we are trying to focus on feeding people in those ways. But that's where the gospel is interesting, because the apostles in this story were focused not on feeding people, but on not feeding people. Let's figure out how we can get out of feeding these people, they were thinking. And as somebody who has to plan meetings, I could kind of relate to this. You know how sometimes you have to have a long meeting, 2 or 3 hours? The timing of when you schedule that meeting says a lot to the people of what they can expect when they get there. If you say, we're going to meet from 11 to 2, everybody knows, we're going to have lunch. That'll be good. So a lot of us who want to save a little money will say, let's meet from 2 to 5. And everybody knows, there we go. All right, I guess I'll bring a balance bar. If the meeting's from 2 to 5, they're not going to feed us. And that's exactly what was happening with the apostles. They're like, Jesus, why don't we wrap this up about 5:45? And then, just let the people go on their way. Doesn't that make sense? And Jesus said, I don't want people ever to come to see me and leave not being fed. I want people who come to see me to be fed. And they said, Jesus, objectively, there's only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish here, and there are thousands of people. We literally can't do it. We don't have enough to feed them. They would barely get half a bite of fish. They'd get a crumb of bread. We can't do it. I had a friend named Mary Frances who was born a Southern Baptist, but converted to the Catholic faith. And so she did it in midlife. And so she went her first 40 years without the Eucharist. She wound up becoming so involved in her faith that she later became a nun later in life. But she said something to me once that really stuck with me. She said, I don't fault people at all if they want to love their Catholic parish. She goes, I want the same thing they want. I want the music to be good. I want the homilies to be meaningful. I want it to be welcoming. I do. She said, but when Catholics say things like they weren't being fed, she said, at a church that's offering the Eucharist, she said, I can't abide by that. It's just not the right thing to say, and it's not the right thing to feel, she said. You are most certainly, she said, being fed, no matter what is true about the rest of the stuff. I'll never forget the last Corpus Christi we had here. 1 year ago, we were here, as we are every year, and at the 11:15 Mass, right in this pew that's empty right now, there was a man in a wheelchair surrounded by family. His name was Al Ledger, and Al had an aggressive tongue cancer that he was dealing with. And he was getting to the end of his life. And he said to his family, even though he was very advanced in the disease and had not left his house for weeks, he said, I want to go to St. Mary's one more time. This week is the week of Corpus Christi, and I want to receive the Eucharist. And his family was really troubled because he was on a feeding tube. And they thought, we can't picture this working. And they were really worried that he wouldn't be able to receive the Eucharist and as a result would be devastated. What if he came for an encounter with the Eucharist and he couldn't receive, or he, through no fault of his own, spit out the consecrated host? What if that happened, they thought? This is going to be very, very hard. And so I'll never forget going over and using the tiniest part of my fingernail to break off the smallest morsel of Eucharist that was touchable. And then I placed it in his open mouth. And he closed his mouth and closed his eyes and had a big smile on his face. And he died later that month, a happy man. He got the nourishment he wanted for the journey. I think there's something meaningful about the fact that sometimes all we get is a tiny, tiny crumb. All we get is a morsel. Sometimes we go up to the cup and there's only one drop in there and it's clinging to the side of the chalice. We can barely receive it. But in those crumbs and in those drops, there is more power than all of the turbines and all of the nuclear reactors on the earth. In the smallest crumb. Al Ledger knew that. And that's why he wanted to go through great effort to be here. And you know, all of us know that on some level. We know that. That's how powerful that is. And you know what's proof of that? Some of us have had horrible weeks in our lives. Maybe you know that there's often a chapter of life where it feels like everything's hitting you, and sometimes you have all of your losses, and work is horrible, and money is a mess, all at once. Even on those weeks when everything has hit the fan, so to speak, never have you come up in line and said, Father, can I have 2? It's been a bad week. I really need 2 this week. You understand, right? Right? Am I right? You've never done that? No one at the chalice ever says, I'm sorry, but can you make it a double? It's been a really hard week. No one has ever said that. Because we know you don't need any more than the smallest amount. And I wonder, is that what the miracle of the loaves and fishes felt like? I've always pictured it being like just massive multiplication, and I think that makes sense, but at the same time, there's a part of me that says, was it a little bit like how I feel the first time that I saw fudge being cut, and I thought, can I have a real piece, please? What is this? Why are you going cheap on the fudge? And then you have a bite of it and you go, all right, I see. You don't need much. And the Eucharist is so much more powerful than fudge. So this week, I wonder if we can allow the celebration of Corpus Christi to help us feel the power of the Eucharist in ourselves a little more. What could you do to better sense the power? Is there something that's in the way that needs to be removed or space that needs to be made? How can you allow this to feed you and fill you? Since we would never ask for a bigger portion because we know that it wouldn't change the power of what we're receiving, is there any chance that we could just allow it to nourish us as fully as it does? This is what gave us such joy yesterday at graduation for SMA. There were days back in the baby boom when the classes had more than 100 students in them. You might have been from a class like that if you went to our school. But we live in a different world today. And so there were only 10. And some might say, what can 10 young people that have been given this education and this virtue and this faith, what could they possibly do? Well, what could a crumb or a drop of the Eucharist do? You and I both know that when it comes to the things of God, even the littlest bit has more power than all the nuclear reactors and all the turbines on Earth.